no, I also am annoyed by Hillary Clinton and think she is a criminal. Then they open up and you can have a conversation. And I don't know. I don't get any benefit from talking to Democratic Party loyalists. It's all verbal abuse every
Nick,
single time.
Thanks for the call. No, we got to go. I think a lot of people feel that way. I think a lot of people feel like they're in the same boat. I'm not sure how many people are willing to take that extra step, like you're talking about, actually switching tickets, switching to the Republican Party. I think more could. It's a little bit chaotic, and there's something in me that just kind of likes that doesn't like how ossified things have become and things we could do with breaking the system up in a couple of ways. So there's something in me that yearns for that. And I don't know, briefly before we move on, we've got another caller to get to, but any take, Jamarl?
20-second take is probably, I don't want my name signed on the Trump. By the same token, if you're trying to win, that's a tactic that you could use to trying to undermine the party itself. But you got to live with the consequences. And those consequences are going to be ghastly for the next 4 years. So yeah, I guess yes or no, just depending on what you're willing to live with. Yeah.
That's the poison.
So yeah, let's go to the next caller.
The other poison pill. Yeah. All right. We've got Joe in Pennsylvania calling in. Joe, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah. So the only thing I share with Biden is the same first name. But, I that previous caller, I tried that approach before, and I just remember how the Republicans, when Ron Paul was on the stage, they wouldn't even let the camera frame him. Like there were 8 people on the stage, but you only saw 7 because he was off camera the whole time. So this time around, I'm voting green. The Democrats, they want their unity. They think that's what the issue is. And like the previous caller said, they're overlooking the independent voters and the unity. They have their unity. They're unified in that the leaders are just looking out for their own personal fortunes, but they're not listening to the independents that feel alienated from both parties and the segments of the Democratic Party that are completely alienated from their own party.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's absolutely right. They did that to Ron Paul, by the way. I remember they used to not even give Ron Paul's ranking in the polling, trying to make it look like he wasn't even in the race. So absolutely right. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back live. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Ritter. We're joined by Scott Ritter this segment and the next. He is a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. Again, Scott Ritter. Scott, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
Good. Yeah, great. Better to have you with us. We're talking about Trump and the Israel-United Arab Emirates deal, the deal between the UAE and Israel, reportedly penned in some sense by Trump. At least that's how it's being received, billed, and distributed in the media, is as a Trump victory. Do you think that's right? What's your take on this deal, Scott?
Well, I do agree that it's a short-term Trump victory. This is purely a political deal. Any relationship this has with actual peace in the Middle East is it doesn't exist. And I say that for the just basic primary analysis. In order for there to be a peace deal, a peace agreement, the normalization of relations between the United Arab Emirates and the State of Israel, this is definitely one where we know which comes first, the chicken or the egg. Israel must cease and desist with any plans on annexation of the West Bank. That's an absolute. the UAE will not move forward normalization until that condition has been met. And they have made that clear, that while they're willing to enter into discussions with Israel about the potential for the normalization of relations, nothing will occur until it's not just a temporary pause in towards a decision for annexation, but that annexation must be taken off the table. And Benjamin Netanyahu has made it quite clear that it is very much on the table. That is just a temporary pause. So this is an agreement that we already know there is disagreement on. The timing of this agreement is everything. It allows Donald Trump to be perceived as presidential, as making the deal that nobody else could make. And he's making that claim right now, that I've done what nobody else has been able to do. It also buys Benjamin Netanyahu, a close Donald Trump ally, time. Netanyahu right now has tens of thousands of demonstrators in the streets protesting his incompetence during the pandemic, and he is facing a criminal trial coming on early in the next year. The last thing he needed was to be boxed into a corner of his own making, where he would have to make a decision about annexation, and that was coming up. He was going to have to pull the trigger on annexing the West Bank. This deal allows him to pause that, push this down the road. So we're going to see Trump taking a lot of credit for something, and then sometime after November, reality is going to hit, and it's going to be obvious that Israel has every intention of annexing the West Bank, and that this peace deal it exists only in name. There's no reality to it.
So Scott,
But
from
Scott,
what you're
if
saying,
that's-
this represents this represents nothing. What you're saying, this is merely a delay. This is just passing the buck slightly a couple of months down the line. The one side of this I am curious about: does the increased connection, if this actually represents that increased connection, the potential for more diplomatic talks, more regional integration, something like that noise between UAE and Israel, do you think that could help to abate the potential for annexation, or to lead Israel to walk back some of its recent actions towards Palestine? By recent, of course, I don't just mean the last couple of years. I mean the last couple of decades. But again, getting back to it, do you think that integration, that connection, the opening of these ties, do you think that's going to weigh on the future in any significant way, or do you think that's more optical as well?
Well, it could if, and this is the biggest if out there, if Palestine were to be brought into the negotiations, where Israel would say there is a viable two-state solution. Right now, there isn't a viable two-state solution. Israel isn't willing to allow a viable two-state solution to exist. And so what would need to be a three-way negotiation where Israel and Palestine agree that there will be a viable two-state solution, and this serves as the foundation for Israel now to constructively engage with the UAE, and then create a network of engagement with other Gulf Arab states and other Arab nations. That potential exists, but you have to cross that hurdle of getting Palestine back on board with the negotiations, and that cannot happen until Israel embraces a viable two-state solution. And so long as you have Israel talking about annexations of the West Bank, so long as you have Israel pointing to the map that was put forward under the so-called deal of the century, this just isn't going to happen. And so, yes, there's the potential. One could say that Israel's trying to nail down the potential of interconnectivity with the Arab world in order to bolster its negotiating posture with Palestine, meaning coming from a position of strength, they will feel able to make concessions to Palestine. Maybe that's in the equation, but that's not what I'm seeing right now. What I'm seeing is a purely political arrangement designed to buy Bibi Netanyahu time, designed to give Trump political cards to play up until November, and no potential of actually being followed through. There's no potential of reality here because Israel is not engaging constructively with Palestine, and therefore the annexation is very much on the table. Therefore, the UAE will never normalize relations.
But Scott, why even give the win? I mean, politically speaking. I mean, because basically what we're talking about is an optics thing. And from an optics standpoint, you have a country that is going through overtly with plans of annexation. You have the UAE that's just made some kind of deal, even if it's just a political deal, even if it's just from the standpoint of the outside world looking at it and it looks like Israel gets its win and Donald Trump gets his win. Why does the UAE go along with something like this if indeed it makes it look like both of these organizations get their win when the UAE is supposedly against the overt policy that Israel is taking right now? I mean, does it really give the UAE any level of influence in Israeli affairs by having an overt political deal like this? Because I don't, like you said, there's no plan in this for there to be a two-state solution at this point. And from Israel's overt plans, they're taking it all.
Right. Well, from the UAE perspective, the win comes from the fact that in just the last few minutes, we've said the UAE many times. What name haven't we said? Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was the lead on the deal of the century, not the UAE. Saudi Arabia was in the first seat. Saudi Arabia was always the prime partner. Whose name have we not said this morning up until right now? Saudi Arabia. And that's the win for the UAE. They have supplanted Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia right now is bogged down in a war in Yemen that the UAE just recently extricated itself from. The UAE is separating itself from Saudi Arabia, from its foreign policy failures in Yemen, and from the disaster that is domestic politics right now in Saudi Arabia. UAE is asserting itself as the future leader of the Gulf Arab nation, emerging from the vacuum created by the ineptness that is Saudi Arabia today. So I think that's the victory that UAE gets out of this. Not that there's going to be peace, but now when we talk about a potential Arab-Israeli peace deal, the nation that's at the top of the marquee, got its name right up there, is the United Arab Emirates, and it's no longer Saudi Arabia. And I think that's the win that UAE gets out of this. Again, purely political.
The Palestinians. How do you have a deal about Palestinians without Palestinians and expect the deal to go through? I thought that was the most ludicrous aspect of this. I accept your point. If indeed there was a situation where somehow the Palestinians were brought into the mix and you could have an honest, actual agreement of sorts. But that's not what's happening. And is there even a potential in Israel for something like that to take place?
Not with Netanyahu, and again, not with Benny Gantz. Israel, there was a time when Israel, was moving toward a two-state solution. But that time ended with the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. With his assassination and the emergence of Bibi Netanyahu as the dominant political force, Netanyahu is successfully, and another thing occurred in Israel at that time. In the 1990s, Israel received a massive influx of refugees from the former Soviet Union. And these Slavic Jews, and many of them aren't Jews, they falsified records to come to Israel. But the bottom line is about 10 to 12% of Israel's population, it grew with this influx of Slavic Jews who have no connection to Israel or the Middle East, no sensitivity to the Jewish-Palestinian issue, the Jewish-Arab issue. They come in with a hard line. We are Jews and Jews only. We will not deal with these Arab scum. And when you increase the electorate by 10 to 12% with a solid voting bloc, you suddenly threw the weight of Israeli politics behind the right wing, behind Benjamin Netanyahu. And that's what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, is this morphing of Israel from a nation that recognized the absolute imperative, the need for peace with the Palestinians if Israel was going to survive as a nation and prosper, to this, dug-in racist state. And that's what it is. It's very much a racist state. It's a state that's xenophobic, a state that lashes out against the Palestinians, that cannot peacefully coexist with the Palestinians, that brutalizes the Palestinians. And I don't know if this modern, manifestation of Israel is capable of the kind of reasoned thinking that occurred in the time of Yitzhak Rabin. I don't believe Israel is that, because even if Netanyahu goes away, Benny Gantz is very much a prisoner of this political dynamic. It's going to require Israel to change as a nation. It's going to require Israel to find the courage for the native-born Israelis to gather together and offset this foreign presence that's coming in and polluted the domestic politics of Israel, because that's what's occurred here. Israel is no longer capable of considering, peaceful coexistence with a Palestinian state. They're a nation that has accepted the inevitability of conflict. The political empowerment of these people comes from the perpetuation of conflict, and that's what we're going to see. So no, I don't believe Israel is capable of embracing the kind of political dynamic that would be required to accept a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. So and I think this is part of the political reality behind the deal of the century, because I believe Donald Trump and his advisors recognize this. They recognize that you can't negotiate with the Palestinians if you've got nothing to negotiate with. So they did an end around, and they made a deal with Israel, and they're trying to bring in the Arab states. But as long as the Arab states continue to toe the hard line and say that we cannot make peace with Israel if they go forward with this annexation, and remember, the second the Arab states, if they ever deviated from this position, there is a vacuum, a political vacuum that has geopolitical consequences. Because if the Arab bloc turns its back on the Palestinians, the Turks and the Iranians and the axis of resistance is ready to step in and fill that block and say, no, we will defend the Palestinian cause. So the Arabs have to be very
Scott,
careful.
Wait. We got to take a break. We're going to bring you in to make that. We want you to talk about this. Absolutely. But we got to take a break real quick. Let's bring you back in. You guys are listening to Scott Ritter. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear, 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're joined by Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter at Real Scott Ritter, R-E-A-L Scott Ritter with 2 T's on both Scott and Ritter. Scott, thank you for being with us. We're talking, of course, about Israel. We're talking about the recent deal between the UAE and Israel. You were saying that this, the significance of this from the United Arab Emirates perspective is that it displaces Saudi Arabia. It changes the balance of power in that region, officially in terms of who's dealing with whom, and in terms of sort of who's being delegated to, as far as I can tell, in terms of the alliances militarily, who has direct ties. Could we get into that for a minute? You were talking about Saudi Arabia, the name we hadn't brought up to that point. Maybe we can bring them back up. Where have they gone? But also more broadly, what do you see as with Mohammed bin Salman? It seems like there was a shift in policy, moving away from just oil sales as the backbone of the Saudi economy into a sort of slightly more diversified things. There was this thing with NEOM, which you guys may remember, which was this like high-tech initiative that MBS pushed for a while back. There are a couple of different areas of diversification. It seems like this is an issue more generally for other Gulf states, for the UAE, for instance, but also Kuwait, Qatar. I'm just curious, what do you think affects the balance of power economically in the region? Where do you think the region is headed in terms of its economy? A number of different countries, obviously with different economies, so it could look different on a case by case basis. But what do you see affecting that shift? And then where do you see the Saudis going if their role is being depreciated by the UAE and other rising countries? And also, you were talking about the axis of resistance. How do you think they affect this as a factor hemming the sort of area in slightly, with, of course, Iran to the east, Russia and Turkey to the north, various dissident parties opposed to what the U.S. would consider its agenda in the region?
Well, to understand the region, we have to understand where it came from. And for the last 50, 60 years, the power dynamic in the Persian Gulf region has been dominated by Saudi Arabia, backed by the military and diplomatic might of the United States. This was an agreement that was born at the end of World War II when Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with the King of Saudi Arabia, and they made this strategic the relationship that Saudi Arabia would be the guarantor of oil and oil stability for the West. And Saudi Arabia has done that by building this massive production capacity and overproduction. Let's say that Saudi Arabia, is exporting, say, 9 million barrels a day of oil, but they have a production capacity that can be surged to up to 12 million barrels of oil a day. And what's the importance of that? That means that, for instance, you can take Iran off the map in terms of exportation of oil, and Saudi Arabia can surge and cover the gap created so that there is no disruption in global oil supply. And that's been Saudi Arabia's role, to ensure constant oil supply, globally. And what we do in order to make that assurance, we back them up with the might of the United States military. And we saw that in 1990, 1991, when Iraq invaded Kuwait and threatened the eastern Saudi oil fields. We mobilized 700,000 American fighting men and women. We built a coalition. We went in and we took Kuwait back, and we guaranteed Saudi Arabia's security. And that's been the relationship. But now we see that, especially in the aftermath of this pandemic, we see that the viability of oil, when you have a precipitous drop in global supply, suddenly Saudi Arabia's overproduction capacity isn't that important. Saudi Arabia has recognized this for some time. That's why they were seeking to diversify their economy, a Vision 2030 program to modernize, to diversify, to bring in banking, to bring in other industries, to liberalize society, to give women the right to drive, et cetera. This was all a vision of MBS. But in order for Mohammed bin Salman to implement this, he had to be the one in power. He's a young man. He sought to make his name as a leader by invading Yemen, by intervening in Yemen. This has been a disaster, and as a result, there's been a lot of internal unrest, a lot of people saying, you're not the man to rule Saudi Arabia, and he's responded by mass arrests, by seizing the assets of people. And this has created a very divisive dynamic in the Saudi royal family. So he's not as strong as he once was, and Saudi Arabia isn't as influential as he once was. Their muscle that comes from being the world's biggest oil producer, or the ability to surge oil production, is no longer there. It's no longer required. It has nothing to back it up. So it's a nation in the decline right now. It has economic problems on the horizon. It has political problems. And if you take Saudi Arabia out of the equation, it's no longer this power. You've got nothing to offset Iran, which is the other regional power. And, the U.S.-Saudi Arabian dynamic has been seen as a means of containing Iran. If you remove Saudi Arabia from the equation, the other Gulf Arab states need to step up to the forefront to represent this bulwark. And that's the United Arab Emirates is trying to do, to say that we are the bulwark against Iranian expansion, but we're not going to do it with muscle, with might. We're going to do it by figuring out how to peacefully coexist. And that's why you see the UAE and Iran carrying out economic ties, diplomatic interactions. So we're seeing a shift in the dynamic, the geopolitical dynamic of the region, with Saudi Arabia becoming de-emphasized and other lesser Gulf Arab states led by the United Arab Emirates stepping into the forefront to try and forge a means of peaceful coexistence with Iran, who has emerged as a major regional player with its access of resistance. It dominates.
That sounds a lot more Pacific.
Go ahead.
Sorry for interrupting. Just a quick question there. That sounds a lot better than the status quo beforehand, the status quo ante.
I think so.
How is that going to happen? I mean, usually this happens by means of trade, as far as I can tell. Usually, if there's some sort of long-term diplomatic entente, that's induced by the incentives of trade. So countries just have an incentive to get along with each other over the course of decades. If they're in some sense interdependent. Is that going to be the cause, or what are the means by which that is going to happen, do you think, with the UAE and with Iran specifically?
Well, the big thing, the big factor here is the decline of the role played by the United States diplomatically and militarily. Yes, we're still there. We're still in the Middle East, but we're a power, a regional power in decline. We see, our position in Iraq is weak, and Syria is weak. Even with Saudi Arabia is weak. And as we gradually are pushed out of the region, what happens as a result is Mother Nature taking over, so to speak. When you eliminate the outside foreign influence of the United States and you allow the regional players to sit down and sort out the problems themselves, they tend to reach the logical solution because it's in their vested best interest to survive, to peacefully coexist. And that's what's happening. We're seeing the vacuum of leadership created by the decline of the United States presence in the Middle East. Nations like the United Arab Emirates stepping up and doing the right thing for their country, and that's what they're doing by reaching out to Iran. It's not the United States, taking a leadership position and encouraging this. This is happening despite the United States, the economic engagement. We've put on a program of maximum pressure on Iran. That has failed. It's made the Iranian people suffer, but the Iranians have figured out how to sidestep this and reach out and develop, new economic relations with China, with Russia, with the United Arab Emirates, with Iraq, with others. It's the natural course of events taking over and doing the right thing. You said this sounds a lot better. It's a lot better because it's about the regional players doing what's right for them, not what's right for the United States.
Scott, if Joe Biden gets in office, though, this flips almost overnight. I mean, he's going to get more invested in Syria. I have a hard time believing he's going to pull back, meaning from the pressure on Iran, at least based on the tweets and stuff that he was saying. How long, meaning, let me say it this way, the pullback that's been taking place, is that something that's more organic that's taking place where the U.S. is just kind of losing power in that region, or is that a loss of focus in the region? And with a re-emphasis in regards to putting more troops, let's say, in Syria, or getting more invested into, Iraq, and reforging some of the relationships in the Middle East. Does that come roaring back, basically, with the Joe Biden administration that adopts a foreign policy similar to that of maybe Obama or Clinton?
We have a military footprint in the Middle East that is still considerable. It's on the decline. It's not being given the attention, the political attention that it used to in the past. It's a very interesting dynamic watching the quote unquote establishment, the military establishment that's been vested in this region for decades, struggle to justify its continued presence there to a political administration that's indifferent. Yes, we're there and all that, but Donald Trump doesn't. He doesn't have the burning fire in his belly to be engaged in Iraq as his predecessors did. He would like to get out of there. And so there's this dynamic. If Biden wins election, the establishment will now have political leadership that does have this burning fire in their belly. And the infrastructure that we have in the Middle East will be rapidly rebuilt. We'll see a reinfusion of American military might. And along with that, we're going to see a rise in friction. Friction brings about conflict. conflict brings about dead Americans. Joe Biden would be the absolute worst thing in the world for Middle East peace, because he is not a peacemaker. He is a man who defends the status quo, and the status quo was built on the premise of American military dominance in a region, and that's the direction we would be heading if Biden were to win. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump is great and everything he's doing. But his indifference towards the Middle East actually creates the potential for the nations of the Middle East to solve their problems themselves, and that's what we see happening. That's the dynamic that we see happening. If Biden gets elected, he is going to reassert the premise that America knows best, and we knows best, backed by the big stick, and he's going to try and come back in and pressure everybody to do what America wants done, and that's just a recipe for disaster.
Scott, I want to thank you for joining us. Let's see, Scott Ritter. Scott Ritter is I'm sorry, give me one.
Former UN weapons
second.
Inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Exactly.
Thank you.
And
I
you can
wanted to
follow
get it
Scott
specific.
on Twitter, by the way. Exactly. Yeah, at real Scott Ritter on Twitter. And by the way, Scott Ritter spelled SCOTTRITTER. So on Twitter, that's real Scott Ritter again. Yeah, Scott, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
We will be back in just a minute with another 2 hours. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Welcome live from the divided states of America. Welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
In the politically independent corner, I am investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, Michelle Obama stole the show at the end of last night's opening online ceremony for the Democratic National Convention, which will be running until Thursday. Weird ceremony, a bunch of screens and video walls. Michelle Obama overshadowed both Biden and Bernie, some would say. I don't think she did, but apparently Shane did. Postmaster General Lloyd DeJoy agreed to testify before Congress, who will be appearing before the House Oversight and Reform Committee on August 24th. Demand is high, with one House member, Representative Jim Cooper, even recommended that DeJoy be arrested if he refuses to testify. That's strong. California faced its largest power outage in decades this weekend, with 3 power companies administering rolling blackouts to millions of Californians to ease grid requirements. The first rolling blackouts since 2001. Death Valley hit 130 degrees, which could be the hottest ever measured with modern instruments. Also, California is set to pass first in-state wealth tax that could hit about 30,400 Californian residents and raise an estimated $7.5 billion for the general fund. The proposed tax rate would be 0.4% of net worth, excluding directly held real estate that exceeds $30 million for single and joint filers, and $15 million for married filing separately, would follow very wealthy people who move out of the state. According to new posting on its website, SpaceX is now planning on turning its Texas launch site in Boca Chica, Texas, into a themed resort. SpaceX is reportedly hiring a resort development manager for the site, a small South Texas village near the company's Starship launch site. Cue parallels to Walt Disney. Yeah, parallels to Walt Disney. But that could be fascinating. France is deploying 130 riot police to enforce masks in the Marseille region, which expanded its outdoor mask requirements to all farmers, markets, and more neighborhoods on Friday. And last, a Friday grand jury has indicted 2 men in the killing of Jam Master Jay, pioneering DJ of Run DMC who was killed in 2002. Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington conspired to kill Jam Master Jay in retaliation for a drug dispute. God, that hurts. You guys are listening. Those are the headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, that last one takes the wind out of you. Look, I do want to talk about the DNC thing, though, even though we can get into the California tax. Because personally, I think that's a great idea. I mean, we're talking about 0.4% of net wealth, and they're talking about raising $7.5 billion. That should give you the level of wealth that I'm talking about. But I want to point something out that took place in the convention last night, Shane. And when you said it was kind of weird, it was kind of strange, I want to agree with you. And I want to agree with you with something else. The Black Lives Matter protests being co-opted and used for the pursuit of getting Joe Biden elected. And I sat there and I watched the family as they were speaking on behalf of the DNC. And I thought, your son was basically murdered by the laws and the mean-spiritedness that was put in place by the person who is running that you are now saying go elect. Meaning Joe Biden is probably more culpable than anybody else that was on that Democratic stage, and that is at the very least in the political space right now, for Floyd being killed. He put in the mean-spiritedness. He was the one that was chastising Ronald Reagan about using the death penalty. You should go back and look at those speeches. Those things were atrocious. And that stuff gets soaked into our criminal justice system. I mean, and so I'm like, you are being used as a prop in order to get a man elected that basically created the system that killed your son. And, you know, I thought back to all of these interviews that we were having and the people we were talking to, and the question we kept asking, and basically that I basically agreed with. You can't allow them to co-opt you and have it as if you guys are working in tandem with the Democratic Party. That is the worst case scenario, because immediately after the election, you will be pushed to the side if that energy cannot be used in the interests of that party. This person, the dad was right here, the George Floyd's brother. I can't pronounce his name. Let's just call him Phil Floyd. Leads a movement of silence at the Democratic National Convention in memory of Black Americans who have been killed by the law enforcement. And when this moment ends, let's make sure we never stop saying their names. That's nice. But should that be affiliated with a party? Especially if the party was responsible for the policies that actually got your son killed. What do you think about that, Shane? I mean, is this what you were terrified of when you thought of the term co-opt? That Black Lives Matter, or people who are associated with, let's say, these movements that are out here, are not the same thing, or don't necessarily want the same thing as the Democratic Party. And affiliating yourself with such basically sucks the life out of the stuff that you wanted. It makes it look as if they are somehow affiliated with your ideals and your values.
Well, it does that and more. I just want to take umbrage. I'm not terrified. I think that was the word you used. I'm not terrified of the prospect.
My bad. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it that way. My bad.
No, that's the thing. No, this whole thing is frustrating, but I'm not a Democrat. I am an American, and it's frustrating to see the American system in this state. And this is a small, I say that as I'm describing one very specific small aspect of it. Black Lives Matter getting co-opted, any movement getting co-opted by another movement. You can view this mechanically as movements just competing with each other in this almost ecological sense, where the DNC is eating up the potential threat that the Black Lives Matter movement represents. But for somebody who, like I am, is opposed to the establishment broadly, thinks it's decayed, thinks it's not doing a good job at what it should be doing, and thinks that we should make efforts to reform it, and thinks that the best way to do that is to promote some alternative organizations, whether it's Black Lives Matter on the left or other ones on the right or center or whatever, across the broad spectrums of political action in society. We need more of that stuff. So it is disheartening to see this happening. But the other side of this is, what can you do with that? So if the stance that you have on being having your movement co-opted, being to that extent marginalized, if the response that you have to that is to get frustrated and to sort of sit back and get even more disenchanted, feel a little bit more enemy, more disconnection from where your society is, then that's not good, but that's your response. If your response, on the other hand, of course, is to get angry and then to figure out how you can take action, and then you get kind of motivated and excited because you're actually doing something, that's better. But that's all from the perspective. I don't know. It's difficult. I'm trying to figure out how to have these conversations so you can do something to incite people to take that kind of positive action for actual, producing good. And it's how do you do that? I think one of the things you need to do isn't just talk. You need to have some actual plan to get from A to B to where you want to go. And then if there's some image of that in sight, then you pursue it. It's until you have that you're just sort of stuck in this cynical, pessimistic mode. It's like, I don't know. If you've grown up, which everybody has, go for it, Jamarl.
Well, if you were, like you said, you're an American and you just want the best for the country. I do too. And when I look at this stuff, I look at it from a human perspective, not necessarily from, Black Lives Matter or this or that. I would prefer that these guys and the country itself functions under class, because ultimately that's black, white, gay, straight, trans, and pretty much everybody, the 99% of the country. And you can expand that out even to the world. If you were let's say the Democratic Party, let's say you're not a Democrat, but let's say you were part of Black Lives Matter, and you had a list of things that bothered you and plagued you that you believe were somehow separate from other things, meaning you believe that the plight that you were engaged in was somehow separate and distinct from the plight of other groups or people in your countries. Basically, let's say tribal politics. What is in your best interest? Is it in your best interest to say, look, the Democratic Party has a lot of people that African Americans just associate themselves with without getting anything in return? We don't want that. We want to defund the police. And in doing that, we want to have that money to get dedicated to housing, to education, to whatever. And they give their list. This is what we want. But what they want is inherently different from what the Democratic Party wants. Is it in your best interest to align yourself with a party that has fundamentally shown itself to be against your interests in pursuit of taking down Trump? Or is it in your best interest to stand in this kind of thing of, look, this is what we want, this is what we stand for? And if that's separate from what the party is, then so be it. With the idea that you understand that in order for you to get anything that you want out of that process, you need to be willing to pull the party to your position. And you can't do it by acquiescing. Now, if that's your logic, which is better, and I know I'm framing this in a particular way, and you can, rip the framing off, but I guess I'm saying it doesn't seem like it is in the best interest of either Black Lives Matter or either of these families who are pained by the murder of their kid in this. I can imagine that. Is it in their best interest to align themselves with a party that doesn't believe those things? And that's the thing that I'm stuck with. I understand that people think Donald Trump is terrifying. I get it. By the same token, you need to look at what was before Trump and ask, was that roses and rainbows? And why is Trump even elected in the first place? Why do you have so many disenchanted people that elect this guy in the first place? Those things aren't necessarily being questioned right now because of the grotesqueness of what people consider to be Donald Trump. I guess I'm asking a very basic question, though. Is it better in your interest to align with somebody who is not in any way going to push through your policies? Or do you just try to function as your own thing and you be a radical for the position to which you have with the goal of pulling the party to your position, which is more ideal? I just don't believe that the acquiescence is the better way to go.
I think it's a false. I think you're right about that last part, but I think it's a false dichotomy. There aren't just those two choices. I think the exciting thing, the thing that people can do that'll make genuine, real change, is to start building up their own alternative. And maybe we can take calls on it. 202-521-1320. If you want to talk about what you're doing, how you're responding to the decline of the DNC, whether you're voting outside of it, if you're choosing to try to reform it from the inside, if you're going over to the Republican Party, as one of our earlier callers was talking about, or if you want to build your own, if you want to, work to create some alternative to the DNC, if you have a vision that you've heard of that you like, if you know people who are doing something like this, please call in 202-521-1320. I mean, you're talking about specifically the family of George Floyd making those connections or concessions or however you want to look at it. I mean, again, they're their own. Yeah. They're their own people. They're not just representatives of this movement. And for them personally, it probably does make sense to try to get those connections. For them personally, for getting restitution for their family, maybe even for other people in America, they're probably going to have their best bet working with the DNC. But it's only a false dichotomy because we haven't created an alternative. That's what the sort of chain of events demands, I think, at this point. There's a huge opportunity right now.
Explain that. Well, you said it's a false dichotomy because we don't have an alternative. Explain.
You don't have an alternative because right now the current monopoly is decaying. And so that when it looks like when something that's doing everything, that's responsible for some sector of reality is in decay, and you need to replace it sort of all at once wholly, then that's what this looks like. There's something wrong with a fundamental aspect of your relationship with your reality, and you need to replace it. And the problem is that it's the sort of collective acting, collective bargaining thing where we're all constituents of this political society. It's not like one thing that one person can replace. But yeah, I mean that's what it is. If there's going to be a solution, it's going to come in time by people working to create an alternative to the current system. You know what I mean? Either by reforming it and therefore changing the status quo, or by creating some alternative that actually replaces it. And the more time that people spend functionally and competently doing that stuff, the better that society is going to look like. But we need to go into a break. Do you want to come back real quick, or should we just pick it up on the other side, Jamarl? What's your take?
Yeah, let's pick it up on the other side. We can do the break now. So
all right.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Absolutely. We'll be back in a moment. Thomas Stranahan, Fault Lines.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're taking calls 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I was talking about how we need a genuine alternative. Basically, I was saying we need to create it. We've got Eric on the line, but do you want to pick this up real quick, or should we just go straight to calls?
I do. Yeah, I want to take 1 minute. I'm going to time myself 1 minute. I tend to be bad at this for 1 minute. And we are taking calls. If you want to join in on the conversation, 202-521-1320, 202-521-1320. You can also chat, etc., etc. You said something about collective bargaining. And I think one of the weirdest things in our political space is that we accept unions. We love unions. We want to expand unions, all of that stuff. And we would make the argument, and people need to understand the basic premise of the union. You have a company that has basically unchecked power, and you have workers who, if they are functioning as individuals, engaging with this kind of larger power that pays their salary, that controls whether they basically eat and can pay their rent. Well, it's so diminutive that individual doesn't necessarily stand a chance in really coming up with a great bargaining because it has no leverage in the process. If you get all the workers together, then those workers do have leverage. Well, those workers can say at a certain point, this is unconscionable. We're not willing to accept this, and we're going to walk. Yes, we're going to lose our salaries, but you're also going to lose your ability to make your cash. And within the context of that, somehow meet an agreement in regards to, okay, what can we come up with that we think we can live with? People don't do that in politics. And that seems to be the weirdest thing in the world to me. You don't have a situation where lefties, after, let's say, Sanders loses, grabs his group and say, you can get our support if you're willing to do X and Y. And you need to explain to us how 88% of the people who are in your party agree with this, and you disagree with this. And this is our terms, or these are our conditions. Now, it's possible that Sanders may think the Democratic Party doesn't care about that, and they are willing to tank it, in which case I think Donald Trump is worse. So despite me eating my pride in this, I have to do this because I think this is better for America. That could be his line of logic with it, but I'm saying from the standpoint of what unions do, you would think that would be what takes place in the political space. And it's the opposite. The Democrats would make the argument to people that, look, blue no matter who, incrementally worse, or at least worse, and you have nowhere else to go. And so, yeah, we got to go there. And yeah, we need all of this money to get elected. We need to do these things to get elected. So you guys shouldn't complain all that much about this. And lefties say, okay. African Americans say, okay. Hispanics say, okay. And the very notion of political contests and trying to wrangle stuff out of it gets just broken, where there's no accountability in a political process, despite the fact that they'll say, rah-rah unions. It's the weirdest thing ever. Let's go to Eric real quick. Eric in New Jersey. What's going on, Eric?
Hi. So this actually ties in from conversation yesterday and this conversation today, and Stranahan's question on what external things that we can do on the ground that have nothing to do with the government, which is kind of funny because I want to say that one thing that Americans have lost concept of is that the private sector is just private government. I mean, if you think about it, all workplaces operate on a particular governmental model. I mean, even organizations that aren't businesses, anytime a group of people gets together, they decide rules or they don't, depends. The group could be, libertarian in the fact that they just loosely gather and the only rule is we show up at this time, or up to a tyrannical, structure like, say, the capitalist business structure where the boss says you do or you fired, right? And then all the bylaws and all that. And now the thing is, if we understood that these private entities would be our government in the way that we understand our government is, something that we can manipulate, something that we can participate in, something that we can actually leverage, then we would actually want to leverage ourselves and our private governments that we participate in. That said, there is something that both addresses the Black Lives Matter topic as well as something you can do outside of participating in the public sphere of politics. There's a group called Cooperation Jackson, and they actively are building worker co-ops, which, by the way, give economic power back to people. They allow them independence with their economic freedom to actually be able to afford, once established, things like providing their own banking to themselves instead of having to rely on predatory capitalist banking, providing their own sources of energy, etc. I mean, this is a very liberating business model, and Cooperation Jackson right now is establishing a network in Mississippi of Black-owned democratic cooperatives for a community that's also working on building ways to make themselves independent of these capitalist control levers. It's a really good organization, and I would definitely suggest looking it up at cooperationjackson.org.
Eric, I'm totally going to check that out. Cooperation Jackson. Yeah, I love that.
Yes,
because basically you're saying democratize the workforce. That's basically what you're saying. That if you want people to get more engaged in the political space, then you need to have structures that are in your society where those people go through, where they know that they're engaging in some kind of political contest. And that's including even in business. Look, I think that's a logical thing. I mean, if you think of Walmart and you think of all of the people that it takes to make Walmart work, think of all the janitors, think of all the cashiers, think of everything that goes on in Walmart. Those people basically come in and go home and they have no control and agency over anything that they do, even though they're infinitely necessary in order for Waltons to walk away with billions of dollars. Maybe they should have a say-so in the company to which they work. And agency, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, considering they're intrinsic to that company to be able to make billions. We have a short amount of time, so let's go to Brave and ATL. Brave, what's going on?
Hey, how you guys doing? Real quick, I think you guys are both hitting the nail on the head. But I think Shane kind of drilled it that without having something else as an option, most people, whether they care or not, don't know where to go. Therefore, they just default. Right. I mean, with my very small, modest platform, I try to spread the information that I receive from channels like yours, and I have some followers. But what they come back with is that, well, what do we do? What do we do? So I think I think the mainstream has succeeded in making our society a code of personality. So without having that one popular person, that one celebrity or star saying, "Hey, go this way or go that way," most people just default. And I think that we're so disaffected that we just don't feel that we have no idea of what power we have or don't have, and we just like tap the switch. Unless you were conscious, you don't have any idea of which direction to go in, so you just default. So I just think it's a matter of being disaffected and really not having a personality. And it's sad to say, but there's no personality for people to follow. That's giving out clear, concise orders, because Bernie was that for a moment, but he bent the knee. So a lot of people are just like, where do we go? And the Black Lives Matter movement is large, but there's no concise direction. So that's how they're able to be eaten up by the Democratic Party. We need some type of leadership. Unfortunately, we do need some type of, Northern Star or something like that. That's all I have.
Agreed, Brave. I mean, one of the exciting things about BLM is that people have been complaining about how it's been a little bit too decentralized, but one of the things that does, of course, is that you get a bunch of local leaders. So people who either had been activists, and this isn't even, you could be talking about this as a conservative. It's weird saying that because they would be critical of the BLM movement, but it applies. You have a bunch of local activists who are suddenly activated, who step up, are suddenly leading dozens or hundreds of people, and those people are going to persist in all likelihood. Even if the national high up movement gets co-opted, you're still going to have a bunch of people locally who've gotten used to organizing together. Now that looks liberal, of course, because this is Black Lives Matter, and so for the most part, it's going to be liberal. I think what we need more of in society is more of that like deep network. Like I'll put it like this: in soil science, if you're looking at soil, you can look at the plants, you can look at the mineral constituents. One of the exciting things, it's a little bit hard to study, but it's the mycelial structure. So it's the sort of mushroom, spore, fungal structure underneath the surface of the soil. The sort of soft network that's a little bit delicate and a little bit difficult for us to measure and to understand, but that we know is incredibly important for conveying minerals back and forth. I think that it's up to us to form that. I think that's sort of the one part of our society. This is a metaphor, of course. It's one part of our society that sort of is very, very difficult to understand. It's tenuous, but it's incredibly important for conveying information and activity, and for sort of, acting for the health of the soil, for the health of the society as a whole. What you need are those soft networks, and so to some extent, it's exciting to see that stuff getting built up. Even though I disagree with some of the BLM stuff broadly, I'm in agreement with it. So that's been exciting. But from this perspective of creating an alternative, I think that is the basis of your alternative. You brought up another point about a culture of personality. I think that's the level where that's healthy. And if people can start acting locally, then pretty soon, in this almost evolutionary or Darwinian sense, from those local leaders, I think you're going to see percolating upwards more and more prominent and competent and experienced national leaders. I think what you need is a long enough timeline of local action where there's something that people are doing, some feedback loop where they can sort of start to succeed and learn and make progress, and then you get that in the long run. That's what our political society needs. And in some sense, the fact that the Democrats failed to lead from the top down means that there's an opportunity for the bottom up to build itself, and that's one of the more exciting aspects, I think, of our present era. Briefly, we've got Malik calling in from DC, and we are taking calls 202-521-1320. Something Eric was saying I wanted to respond to. Just very briefly, I'm going to give myself liberty here, 20 seconds maybe. He was talking about Cooperation Jackson. I was looking into it a little bit. There are a bunch of these communities, and these are exciting. He was talking about sort of different political structures in the private sector in terms of what businesses, how businesses work, how those run. I think this is super exciting field for investigation and experimentation. But it's also cool because a bunch of these local communities working on like alternative currencies, alternative ecological paradigms with permaculture and different farming systems, and then of course different like community structures. This stuff is exciting. And I feel like there's been this history of decades of sort of persistent experimentation. It's just a matter of what that looks like if you're trying to actually create a viable alternative political system, whether you can build something up out of it. And I don't know that we can. I don't think that this stuff is mature enough. But I think it's our best shot probably from that local level. So we just need to keep on it. Anyway, I should go to calls. Malik calling in from DC. Malik, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, how you doing there? It's Malik.
Pardon me, Malik. Sorry about that.
No problem. I just wanted to give a slight, different perspective. I'm a longtime organizer. I come up in what is considered the traditional Black liberation movement, whether that involves African internationalism or Black nationalism, and our general perspective is amongst the youth, and a lot of us do support Black Lives Matter in a broad sense. Many of us do not support the leadership. We saw the leadership as being co-opted as far back as the Ferguson protests.
Right.
Our thing is, many of us, and myself included, we want our youth to actually investigate their historical movements, the historical movements that actually still do exist and have largely not been co-opted, because we see that our many of our youth and our younger adults have stepped outside of the Black community. And as far as our perspective goes, you're always going to be co-opted. You're always going to be corralled by the Democratic Party at that point. If you don't see if the Black community constantly sees itself as one and the same, or our interests are one and the same as the rest of America, which it largely is not. And I know you guys probably likely disagree with that, but we keep seeing our younger generations put their foot in it. One by embracing liberalism is a huge mistake, and we wish that they would come back to a more grassroots African internationalism, if not Black nationalism itself.
Malik, very interesting call. You know what? We've got to go into
I wish you would have called in the first 10 minutes. Yeah, I wish you would have called Malik in the first 10 minutes. You're going to have to call back. Oh, man, I wish you would have called in the first 10 minutes, because you called at the end of the hour. And this is a conversation that is utterly fascinating to me. I love this.
Yeah, we could devote at least a couple of minutes to it. But we should go into a break. We're going to be back in a minute with Marshall Auerbach, market analyst and writer for the Independent Media Institute. You have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thank you to everybody, by the way, for the great calls. Again, we'll be back in a minute. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.
I don't have Marshall yet. He's not picking up on Skype.
Find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
No Marshall.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you out of Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can listen to us on the radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We are also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us the like, the share. Also, if you want to join in with the conversation, we've had plenty of calls this or earlier today. You can send in the chat, you can send in a tweet, and of course, call at 202-521-1320. Coming up in a moment will be Marshall Auerbach, but we are trying to get a connection with him, and he'll be on in a moment. Shane, we've had some really good conversations today. I really wanted to engage the last caller. Because those are interesting conversations when you get into this notion of, look, what do you want the world to look like? And there's no right or wrong in that answer. There's only cause and effect. Meaning, you can have a dystopian vision of the world that you personally would be okay with, or you can have this kind of utopian vision of the world and everything in between. And as long as you're not talking about objective items and objective things, you're just talking about kind of subjective states, then that can be anything. That's why I hate those arguments. I love capitalism. I love socialism. That doesn't really get you anywhere. You can love whatever you want. What is the cause and effect of those items, and are you willing to accept it? And I think with the caller, I think he would have gotten into items where I could broadly accept, and then when you get into the details, not accept. And so that's why I would have loved to have that conversation with him.
Yeah, no, that's a kind of interesting conversation to have. I mean, we're in a space right now. The other side of the end of history is that you don't know what's happening. So the other side of this sort of ideological cul-de-sac that it seems like we found ourselves in the last century is it's not real. the sort of false trifecta. I don't even know how many ideological schisms you want to try to impute to the last century, but communism, fascism, liberal democracy. Exactly. These are it's a sort of false pantheon of these are not inevitable end states, and so there's a whole bunch of different ways we can experiment. I mean, I'll be honest, I'll lay all my cards on the table. I've been thinking about this stuff pretty intensely, and as far as I can tell, it's like the kind of thing that I'm going to be working on for as long as I'm alive. Like, what are the viable alternatives? What do they look like? How do you describe them? How do you even know what you're describing? Sort of the philosophy of science, but of these social objects, of how our societies could be constructed, and of the beliefs that we're ultimately basing our societies on. All that stuff, that whole body of thought and experimentation and stuff. I feel like we're still very early on in our understanding of this. And in the same way that at different pivotal points in history, you've seen sort of philosophy and science and society moving side by side very quickly in periods of expansion and development and experimentation. I think we're in one of those. So you're talking about not knowing what it looks like and having the potential for change. I think we're in one of those periods, man. I think that very, very really anybody who's listening to this, anybody who's thinking about this kind of thing, there's so much frontier out there still to explore, and in some sense maybe even to settle in terms of experimenting with different viable political societies. Now, when Eric was calling and he was talking about doing it on the scale of a business, say, or on the scale of a private organization or something like this, in the private sector was the phrase he was using. What's your take on that, Jamarl? On different political experiments?
I think it's an awesome idea, kind of because I think the problem, in some part, is that we have a system where you're being told, not necessarily your creativity is not necessarily something that we push for. Like, we think that imagination and creativity are just those things that some people have. It's God-given, as opposed to something that maybe can instill based on the way you teach your kids. And if you have a education system where there's a teacher who just tells people what they're supposed to think and believe, and then after they get out, you have a job that the person depends upon, where here's a boss that tells them what to think and believe and to do, and when he goes home, he's exhausted his mental and physical energies, and the only thing he does is go to bed. Well, you have a system basically where people largely are just doing stuff that other people are telling them to do without having any agency or creativity or even input into the process in any real meaningful way. So if we're saying that, look, if your job was structured in a way where the CEOs and all of that stuff wasn't a part of it, you had the workers who were running the company, and those workers had to make decisions in regards to what they were going to do, who was going to lead that particular company, the agency they were going to be involved in, the amount they were going to get paid, what they're going to use, how they're going to do it. They're still under the guise of a capitalistic system, even though it's something else, because at that point the workers own those companies. I think it does force a certain degree of agency, that people just by definition almost have to be more involved in the way that the company operates. They almost get more involved in the way that the government operates. Now, that could be true or that could be not true, meaning people could still go to that company, vote on people who's going to run it, and then check out. I may be entirely wrong on it, but the only way you know it is if you do it. And I see no harm in doing those type of experiments and trying to figure out what's best. There's one thing I want to talk about too that you mentioned. None of this stuff is real. None of it. You are on a game board for all intents and purposes, where you have a physical system that allows you to operate. That's what's real. Everything else is conceptual. What I mean by that is people get very fired up. Capitalism is the only way to do X or Y. They feel strongly about it, but that's only because they grew up in this country in this way that put those things in them for them to come to that particular belief system. It's just a religious belief. You can have whatever world you want, providing the world is sustainable. And yeah, it has to work in tandem with human nature. And I know we always get into this fight about human nature stuff. But all I mean by that is whatever environment that you end up with, you as a physical system is going to operate in that system. It has to be sustainable from the standpoint of who you are, your life, and yeah, the world around you, because you can destroy the world around you. Everything else is up for grabs, which means that you can have our world that we have now, And oftentimes we ask, how do we make this world better? How do we change it? And the unfortunate truth is that this is almost a mechanical process where we go from moment to moment to moment with these kind of small perturbations. And every so often it crashes and people come together saying, okay, we screwed that up. How do we do it again? My hope is that the crash is no longer necessary because we've evolved to the point of saying, okay, maybe we don't need that crash. Maybe we can change without it. I don't have that hope. I'm more dystopian in this way. Whether that gets to the point of it crashes and it becomes better, then maybe. And so if anything, my hope goes farther out in the sense of, okay, maybe we're in prehistory and this stuff crashes. And hopefully we get our stuff together before it gets to the point that the level of brinksmanship that we express even in our environment or in our engagement with each other doesn't end us.
He's on.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't end us. That's my hope. So it's dystopian. It's cynical, but, in 1,000 years, maybe have a better life. But we have Marshall Arbach here.
Hopefully, we'll see.
Marshall, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sorry, guys, about the
excellent.
technical issues I had this morning.
Excellent. Marshall Arbach is a market analyst and writer for the Independent Media Institute, a nonprofit organization that features a diverse array of independent media projects and programs, and member of the AmericanCompass.org, a weekly established think tank formed to restore an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation, liberty, and prosperity. He is also a research associate for the Levy Institute at Bard College. Yeah, Marshall, thank you for coming on. We appreciate you for joining us.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
So, Marshall, we were having a conversation the other day, and we were talking about the price of gold, and how there was this kind of weird thing that was taking place where gold and, better yet, let's go to that 1 second. Let's talk about the UAE and Israel deal. We had a conversation about that earlier this morning, and so let's get a secondary opinion on that deal. How do you view that deal? Do you view that deal as a win for Trump? And is this just optics, or is there a reality to this that goes under this deal where the UAE is indeed working with Israel in real terms, that it's not just a political deal?
Whether you think I think it's very good for Trump. I think it's also a win for the UAE, it's good for Israel. I think Palestinians are getting screwed royally, but I think they've never been as important as the self-made alleged. But it is a very, very big deal, and I suspect there'll be other Gulf states that fall, maybe Bahrain or Oman, and ultimately I guess Saudi Arabia as well. So I do think it's highly significant.
But do you think the deal is based on this notion that, let me say it this way, is it an issue? We had Scott Ritter on earlier, and we were asking him about the deal, and he kind of made the point, like you said, the Palestinians, if this deal is legit and the UAE is going to work with these kind of diplomatic ties with Israel, then the Palestinians are getting screwed in this. But he was arguing that basically, look, just because they made this deal in a political sense doesn't necessarily mean that they are actually working hand in glove, in tandem with this notion of full diplomatic ties, especially if Israel is going to go through with the annexation. And that basically this was optics.
Israel has suspended the annexation, and I think that, in a way that they've upended the traditional land for peace formula. They basically said, they've effectively got a peace deal by suspending the threat of annexation. So for them, it's a great deal. And, they're already opening phone lines. The Sheikh of the UAE was quite adamant that he wanted Israeli investment to come in there very, very quickly. This didn't sound like just a straight political deal. I think, regardless of whether you think what the merits are, whether it has popular legitimacy or not, I think it is highly significant. And I think it's just, big league.
So what do the various actors get out of the deal? Meaning, what does the UAE get out of this? Is this just, from their standpoint, an economic opportunity, or is it also some kind of opportunity politically and economically?
Economically, they get access to a lot of Israeli high-tech investment. Israel's probably the most sophisticated and economically powerful country in the region. and they probably get the protection of the Israeli defense shield as well in the event that Iran causes a problem for them. Although I will acknowledge they have relations with Iran as well. And for Israel, it's just another set of people, another set of countries that they get peace with. And for them, it's fantastic because they effectively have de facto annexed the West Bank, and they haven't given up anything for it. They will still have the longer-term problem of the demographics, but they'll deal with that when the time comes. But in the short term, for sure, I think both countries come out well ahead, and obviously it's great for Trump because and for Jared, I guess, because they've done something that no other administration before them has been able to do, at least since Jimmy Carter. So whether you like the guy or not, and I'm not a fan, everyone laughed at him when he said he was going to remake the Middle East. Ironically, Trump is who's supposedly this America First guy, and is despised by the Never Trump neocons, has reconfigured the Middle East strategically in the manner in which the neocons envisage. They said, we'll get rid of all these, extremist Arab regimes. We'll have an alliance between the conservative Gulf states and Israel, and effectively create a massive alliance against Iran, which they claim is the real hegemon in the region. So I think it's very, very striking that this guy has done a better job of carrying out the Bush-Cheney agenda than Bush and Cheney did.
Well, wait, you mentioned something. With all, in fact, it's 8:40. Okay, I'll just say it, and we can bring it back over on the next break. But you mentioned something there with this notion of bringing together all the conservative states and getting rid of some of these totalitarian states. From the standpoint of the United States and the oil production that was taking place for us, meaning we started to produce a huge amount of oil, which basically dropped the price of oil around the globe. Does that that makes states like Saudi Arabia, I would imagine, less important. And with a deal like this that basically edges out Saudi Arabia, where does Saudi Arabia stand at this point in that, if all of this does to some degree marginalize the country itself? So let's do this. Let's go to a break. We'll be back. You guys are listening to Marshall Arbach. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition.
Hey, Marshall, are you there?
I'm there. Along with.
All right, great.
Fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan and Auerbach. We're continuing a conversation with Marshall Auerbach. Last segment, we started it, picking it back up this segment. He is a market analyst and writer for the Independent Media Institute. That is a nonprofit organization featuring a diverse array of independent media projects and programs. He is also a member of American Compass. You can check them out at americancompass.org. That is a newly established think tank working to restore an economic consensus to emphasize the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. That's my kind of language. He's also a research associate for the Levy Institute at Bard College. By the way, you can follow him on Twitter at @MAuerbach. That's MAUER back with BACK, by the way. Marshall, thank you again for being with us. We're talking about the UAE and Israel last segment. I kind of want to change those. We're painting it partly in terms of not just the geopolitical significance for the Middle East itself, but also for Trump as maybe an optical win for now, whether it's a political win going into the election. We'll see whether it genuinely reshapes those lines. We'll see again, but maybe we can bring it back to the States. I want to look for a second at our economy. And this runs the risk of dominating the conversation, so I want to try to put up some boundaries in advance. Hopefully it doesn't do that. We've had you on to talk about MMT, modern monetary theory stuff before. As far as I can tell, there's this one big discrepancy that's sort of sitting right behind the public center of attention, sort of awkwardly occupying this place of uncertainty in the cultural mind or something like this, which is fundamentally our government is spending trillions of dollars on these stimulus packages. And we also see, an economy in disrepair, a bunch of people having to stay at home, the stock market all out of whack with the stock, NASDAQ, various indexes doing pretty darn well despite global economic apparent catastrophe. So there's this weird, there's this bundle of sort of unpacked contradictions here.
Yeah.
Is there anything you can briefly do? Again, I want to put up some boundaries, but in a minute or two, maybe, just to resolve, what is the deal with the government printing money? Can they print a bunch of it? If they print a bunch of it, what happens? Why aren't they printing a bunch of it if they can? And why does this not make any sense? Because it just, frankly, it doesn't to me. It seems self-contradictory. What am I missing, Marshall?
Well, they are creating tons of money. When they appropriate these funds, the funds are effectively spent into existence. So the trillions are going into it, but they're not being, they're not being deployed particularly for enhancing the productive capacity of GDP. They're largely being deployed to sustain as much of the economy as possible while we're in this weird shutdown. And at the same time, you've got the Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, backstopping everything in sight. And so, market participants have taken their cues from that and basically saying, well, if I know the Fed's got my back, I might as well just pile into the markets. And remember, that the people that participate in the stock market largely reflect, the top tier. They're actually not doing so badly out of this crisis. So it's just another, it's symptomatic of the extreme inequalities that we have in this country and the fact that policy is being directed towards salvaging them. A large part of the rise has been the high-tech companies, many of which have done extremely well out of this crisis: Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, etc. So in that sense, it's also been a real positive, and the NASDAQ has hit a new all-time high during this crisis. So it seems weird, but actually it's not when you think about it. It's kind of more like what used to happen in South America all the time in these crazy emerging markets rallies where the whole country goes to hell, but the elites do extremely well out of it.
Basically, 80% of the stocks are held by the top 10% of the population?
Yeah. It's I'm not sure what the exact numbers are, but certainly they are the major beneficiaries, not the average guy in the street, whether that be a taxi driver, a health worker, or the person stacking those groceries at Whole Foods.
So one of the problems with this, so I just looking at we were talking about the stock market here real quickly. It seems like not productive. I was going to say one of the areas of the productive economy, but that's not exactly right. One of the areas of the economy that can still enrich people if you invest money in it. Of course, the stock market, that's the consistent thing. It's the sort of abstract thing that allows you to invest in various sectors of our economy.
If you have the money to invest in the first place, a lot of these people don't have the investments. That's the problem. That's the thing. This comes. It's like this whole. The argument about. One of the arguments. I don't want to distract too much from the main point, but one of the main arguments a lot of the reparations economists like Derek Hamilton or Sandy Darity make is that if you just give a paycheck to a black person for reparations, it's not going to help them because they don't really have equity in the country. So you want to make sure that people can benefit from investments when they have pre-existing equity, which isn't the case in a lot of these instances with the stock market.
No. I mean, and that's the thing. Like you're saying, it's capital enriching itself. I mean, that's
yes.
How capital tends to work. But another side of this, kind of where I wanted to go with it, the stock market is also a key signal. So it's also obviously taken as a key signal.
I don't think it is anymore.
Well, then when did that stop? What makes you say that?
I just think that the expansion of moral hazard by the central bank, the fact that you're never allowed to lose money in the markets anymore, the fact that a market fall seems to create this massive monetary response where no one's allowed to experience losses anymore because it's said to create such systemic dangers for the economy as a whole, which tells you what's really wrong with our economy. So that's been happening, I would argue, since the late 1980s, but it's really expanded significantly since the time of Greenspan, Bernanke, and now it seems that the Federal Reserve doesn't just view the stock market as a neutral barometer of economic activity, but actively tries to impact its performance because they seem to think that this creates a wealth effect, which it does for a small number of people. But it's moral hazard.
Is this just Goodhart's law? Is that just kind of Goodhart's law coming into effect, Marshall? Or do you see that as something different?
No, I think so. And I think, but I just think it's classic. What I call moral hazard. I mean, if you're going to continue to backstop, as a lot of my libertarian friends would say, it's like having heaven without hell. And that's not the way a capitalist system is supposed to work. Whether you think a capitalist system is a good thing is a separate issue, but certainly the cleansing aspects of capitalism is supposed to be that you lose money, you can go bankrupt, you purge the system, allow it to be recreated, and none of that's happening right now. So we've got a zombie economy. You've got companies like Boeing that make planes that fall out of the sky, that hundreds of them are literally sitting in tarmacs across the world, and they're getting $20-30 billion bailouts, which they probably won't help them in the end because they're in a death spiral. And likewise with the airlines, a lot of restaurants aren't going to come back. So it's not. I don't see what kind of when a company declares bankruptcy, as I think Hertz did, and the stock goes up or Kodak goes up because they get a de facto bailout via the Defense Production Act, and that's not really indicating anything other than the fact that you've got a casino which has been tilted very much away from the house towards the people that are investing in it.
So like a casino, you're talking about a
foreseeable though.
No, go for it, tomorrow.
Right?
Go for it.
Well, this is to some degree foreseeable. I mean, basically, you're talking about putting people, human beings, into an economic system, and that effect of pain that is supposed to just take place every 7 years as the stock market kind of just falls or the economy hits the skids, is, as you called it, a cleansing aspect. Meaning people losing their jobs and everything else is something that's supposed to take place.
Well, that's the theory. I don't applaud it necessarily, but my point
well, not
is
applauding.
Yeah,
well,
but my
I'm
point
not
is
applauding
the
it.
Stock market. No, but the stock market, I'm just saying, isn't really an indicator anymore. I think the so-called market incentives that are supposed to be providing signals to investors aren't really there anymore. They've been completely distorted by the backstops that have been created by the Federal Reserve.
No, I understand. I guess I'm arguing this is basically human beings functioning in a system where they're trying to cut down pain, and that you have an oligarchical system that basically is holding up and propping up an economic system that can't function on its own. I mean, that's basically, it sounds like the argument that you're making.
Yeah, I think it's longer term unsustainable, but for how long, I don't really know. But yeah, I would argue that it's withholding pain from a small cohort in the country. It's not doing it for everyone. I think the joking line is, and I think it's true. It's socialism for the wealthy and capitalism for the rest of us. So it's manifestly unfair system.
Yeah, but they're doing it for themselves. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Meaning, the people who they're basically doing that for are just themselves.
Of course, it's becoming a massive self-enrichment trough, and that's been the problem with the U.S. economy, I would say, increasingly over the last 40 years, that it's being increasingly skewed, the benefits for it to a smaller and smaller number of people.
How does it crash? If the government is going to prop it up, hold it up like Atlas, how does that crash?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, you would think that ultimately the second or third order effects will ultimately ensure that it does crash, or that there are economic discontinuities created. But look, I after 2008, I thought this would entail create fundamental restructuring and change in the economy, and then it didn't happen. And then I thought, well, the next time it'll happen, you'll get something, but you might need something as severe as the Great Depression to dislodge the economic elites. Except that this time the Great Depression was self-imposed by the government, by virtue of imposing a lockdown. They did it for, to cope with the pandemic. But it has actually facilitated further corporate looting. So it's made the problem worse. And I don't really know what it will be that does change it. But yes, I agree that change needs to happen, and it will ultimately happen, or you'll help, revolution.
So we're talking about this system mechanically breaking down. We were talking earlier about the stock market as a broken signal. I actually want to come back. We're talking again. If we're living in a house of cards and everything is somewhat illusory in terms of the productive capacities of various businesses, in terms of where you're actually supposed to look to tell how healthy we are and where we're going, where would you look? What are the valid signals if it isn't the stock market? Would you follow the Fed? What are the numbers you'd look at, Marshall?
Well, the fact that you've got 20% at least unemployed right now is not the sign of a healthy economy. I think that's fair to say. The fact that you've got, the so-called Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, is at extremes that we haven't seen in over 100 years, is also a sign that it's not that you haven't got a fundamentally well-functioning economy. I would say the fact that we've got a public health infrastructure which is purely clearly unable to cope with the pandemic in a way that other countries have done is another sign that you've got massive political dysfunction. There's something wrong here. So whether you think it's a very, very dysfunctional economy, it's not working for the vast majority of people. I think there's ample signs out there.
I hear you on that. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, Marshall. Really appreciate it. Sad we couldn't get you on sooner, but like you were saying, a little bit of technical difficulty there.
Yeah, apologies. I'll make sure that it works out better next time. So thanks again.
Oh, no, yeah, thank you again for joining us. All right, for everybody listening, that was the voice of Marshall Auerbach, market analyst and writer for the Independent Media Institute. That's a nonprofit org. Check it out. Also, he's a member of AmericanCompass.org. Check that out, too. And he's a research associate for the Levy Institute at Bard College. We will be back in a minute with our last hour. You've been listening to the most disruptive show in American radio, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
And we are back live from the divided states of America. You're listening to the most disruptive show in American politics, in the politically independent corner, my corner, I suppose. Although, again, as I've made this point before, if there's an independent corner, like a centrist corner, how can you have a centrist corner just right there? It doesn't make any sense for a corner to be in the center of the room. But in the politically centrist corner, I am independent political investigative theorist and analyst Jane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
Apparently, the middle and the left of that wall are all that remain. There's the right portion of that wall is currently vacant. Although maybe, I don't know, maybe half of my butt is on that side of the wall sometimes. Anyway, together on that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, and we're getting back into it. We're doing the headlines once again. We do these every morning, 7, 8, and 9 a.m. Eastern. Of course, we'll intersperse some of the topics, some of the news of the day throughout with our guests, but straight back into it. In the news, Michelle Obama, arguably, I'm going to say this, Jamarl pushed back, but I am going to say it again. I would say Michelle Obama stole the show last night. At the end
I didn't push back. I just said Shane's point of view. That's all I said. That's all I said.
The point of view of my esteemed colleague and opponent. No, I'm just kidding. I think she did. I think here's what I'll say. If you look around, again, opening night of the Democratic National Convention, running until Thursday, weird ceremony. But if you look around at like CNN or MSNBC or just different websites, everybody's focusing on her speech. Like, you'll see Biden's picture, you'll see Bernie's picture, but really it's about her. I mean, she is front and center there as far as I can tell. And that's why I think even though she's denied it, even though she stepped away from it, she would have made a great vice presidential candidate. Again, I wouldn't have voted for her. I wouldn't have liked her necessarily that much more than Kamala, but hey, I think she would have been a little bit more accessible for people. But that's her choice as far as I can tell.
She would have been a powerhouse as a vice president. And again, they wouldn't have gotten my vote, but you're talking about, look, they kept saying, we're not taking the black community for granted, we're not taking black, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, that's nice. If you really want to galvanize people in that way where you feel like you're giving something back even though you're not giving anything back, Michelle Obama should have been the vice presidential pick. She would have been 1,000 times better than Kamala Harris.
She would have. Again,
and this is somebody who doesn't even like, I think it would have worked extremely well. Accessible is an understatement. She is a lawyer. I'll say she has a competent mind. I mean, for that matter, she used to be Obama's mentor. So from a standpoint of a person who's competent, capable, and who's beloved by the public, yeah, she would have been perfect for it. I don't even know why she wasn't necessarily up there in one of the top choice to choose. I don't even know the downside of choosing Kamala. You say you are?
I'm glad that she didn't. No, I'm glad that she did not. I mean, the other side of this is she would have been good, but like another way of looking at this, do we really need more dynasties? Does America really need a prolonged aristocracy where we have,
I'm not
a
saying
Bush
I love
dynasty, a Clinton dynasty, an Obama dynasty? Does every family that gets involved in politics need to become a family of politicians?
I am not saying I love it. I'm just saying from the standpoint of effective, I think she would have been effective.
Totally.
I really do.
And I agree.
But let's go with the headlines. We need to do the headlines.
Totally.
Talk about it after.
We can't. We talk about it after. We got a little bit more time in these later ones, but let's get through them. All right. Yeah, that was, again, opening night of the Democratic National Convention. Bernie also spoke. More speakers lined up in the next couple of days, including AOC, who was cut from a longer speech down to about a minute, which, many progressives are pushing back on. Anyway, that's DNC news. In related national political news, Postmaster General Louis DeJoy agreed to testify before Congress. This comes after he'd been coming under both scrutiny and increasingly pressure from various Congress people, including specifically Democrats. He will be appearing before the House Oversight and Reform Committee on August 24th. Demand, again, is high. One House member, Representative Jim Cooper, even recommended that DeJoy be arrested if he refused to testify. Thankfully, that appears to have not come to pass. I don't know. That seems like it's pushing the system a little bit too much, pushing the system to its breaking point, which on the one hand, I wholeheartedly encourage. On the other hand, I don't actually want the system to break. In our next story, California faced its largest power outage in decades this weekend, with 3 power companies administering rolling blackouts to millions of Californians to ease the power grid's requirements. These are the first rolling blackouts in the state since 2001. Death Valley, meanwhile, hit 130 degrees, maybe the hottest ever temperature measured there, with modern instruments at least. Again, there was one measurement from over a century ago where it was like a box that was left in the sun using an old thermometer, and they're not sure whether they should take that measurement seriously, but it was like 134. Anyway, modern instruments. This is the hottest ever recorded temperature, apparently. California, meanwhile, is set to pass the first in the nation state wealth tax that would hit about 30,000, a little over 30,000 Californian residents, raise an estimated $7.5 billion for the general fund. This would be a proposed, a slight additional. We'll see how much of an actual tax increase this is. But this would affect the predominantly very wealthy, like people with more than $1 million a year in income, that level of wealth, $30 million or more total assets. So the very wealthy. And it would also apparently follow them if they moved out of the state. Which again, we can come back to that. We've got to get through headlines. We should talk about that though. In our next headline, according to a new posting on its website, SpaceX is now planning on turning its Texas launch site in Boca Chica, Texas, into a themed resort. So SpaceX is reportedly hiring a resort development manager for that site. Posted this to their website. The Boca Chica, by the way, it's a small South Texas village. It was small, at least, until recently becoming the sort of closest local site to the company's Starship launch site. So the launch site for SpaceX's Starship space vehicle. We've talked about this before, and maybe we should talk about this too, because again, cue the parallels to Walt Disney. That's one of the first things I was thinking after reading about this and looking into it a little bit more. Elon Musk is one of those dudes who just kind of reminds you of going for that kind of. It's partly because he has a number of different companies that all sort of fit thematically, I think. And Walt Disney was one of those other very prominent entrepreneurs, business owners, whatever term you want to use. Anyway, Next headline, France is deploying 130 riot police to enforce masks in the Marseille region, which expanded its outdoor mask requirements to all farmers markets and more neighborhoods on Friday. And in our last headline, a federal grand jury back in the U.S. has indicted 2 men in the killing of Jam Master Jay. It was the pioneering DJ of Run DMC who was killed in 2002. Carl Jordan Jr. and Ronald Washington reportedly conspired to kill Jam Master Jay in retaliation for a drug dispute. Sad, but again, that's our last headline. That's the top news. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So Jamarl, yeah, you were talking. We brought this up. We should talk about this for a second. The wealth tax in California. This is interesting, man. I mean, on the one hand, this is pretty damn heavy-handed. I know some people there who don't make nearly this much and are like, hey, this is too much.
Yes, it is.
I mean, but what about the issue of capital flight? That's what everybody brings up with this thing, right?
And that's what they're trying to fix. How do you deal with that? Like, that's their problem. The problem of great wealth, right? That the moment that the state tries to do something about the great wealth, well, if you have billions of dollars, if you have, let's say, $500 million, it doesn't take much for you to leave. Even if you have a company, you can leave. And that's the concern that I think California has, which is the reason why they're saying the tax will follow you. I don't know how that works, though. I mean, like, that seems weird to me. I'm living in Richmond, Virginia, and I leave from Richmond to, let's say, I don't know, Idaho, and the taxes from Richmond follow me even though I'm not living in Richmond? Like, that's bizarre. So I understand what California is trying to do. I don't even have an issue with the tax. They're talking about 0.4%. Put that in perspective. Think about what that is. You're talking about a 4 cent on a dollar. And so that's what you're talking about. You're talking about bringing, what, $7 billion? Like some ungodly sum of money, which gets across how much money you're talking about these people have that they're taxing. And so the leaving and following people when they leave California is dodgy to me. I don't know how you do that. That just seems illegal. So it's like if I'm living in Idaho, I'm going to pay California and Idaho. It's bizarre.
That would undoubtedly face that would spend a bunch of time in the judicial branch. That would spend a bunch of time getting worked out in the courts. Undoubtedly, you know what I mean? It's the first of its kind, so pretty much that just you can take as given the fact that it's gonna face some unique scrutiny. It's sui generis in that sense. But
yeah, but it does present a point. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It does. I mean, it's a couple of incentives deep. So you have people being, if this law gets passed, you have wealthy people being incentivized to not move to California if they're worried that, either as a precedent or just if they don't want to deal with this one tax itself. If they're worried about, say, the state takes this as precedent, starts to pass more extensive laws, raises the taxes, and then people who are currently living there are saddled with that. So there's an incentive for people to not move to California, but of course there's also an incentive to not move out of state if you currently live there, because you'd be paying double taxes as far as I can tell. You'd be paying excess taxes, at least California's taxes, if you moved out of state. So even though don't
buy that this is going to pass.
This heavier weight.
I don't know how that passes. I don't know how that works. How does a state force you to pay taxes when you're not living in that state? That seems the most bizarre thing in the world to me. I mean, I know the United States does it. Yeah, but states are not countries. Exactly. States don't even have sovereign currency. I mean, like, a state is under the guise of the United States of America. Federal law, and you have state law. If I leave a state, it looks like I will be going into the law of another state, which includes their tax system. Maybe I'm missing something. And maybe this is one of those things where we need to bring somebody on to delve into. But this just seems just wrong. Like, look, it's one thing if the United States, it's one thing if the United States passes this and says, because it incentivizes a race to the bottom, which is basically what it does. If you basically have California that raises the taxes because it needs additional revenue, and Texas say, I'm not going to do that. And Texas starts making a pitch and says, hey, you businesses that don't want to be in these liberal states that are raising taxes right now, come to Texas. Then you have another state, Alabama, come to Alabama. Now, there may be other things ideologically that those companies may not like in Alabama, but from a fiscal decision, of a fiscal choice, you may actually find some people, probability that moves. That would have to be across the country. Otherwise, you have this kind of, like Ireland. Like Ireland was a business hub where people can go where they don't necessarily want to pay their taxes. And you have all of these companies in Ireland, technically, whereas the other stuff and all of the mechanics are in another state or in another country. This is what you're going to get in the United States. I mean, if you're going to pass a law like this, it has to be passed nationally. I just don't know how this works on a on a local level. It just seems weird to me.
I don't know how this is going to work either. That's the thing. Like you were saying, we should get somebody on it. It's interesting to me. I'll just point this out. It's interesting to hear you. It's interesting to hear you sort of being a little bit cautious about this, and it's good. It's good. It's just
it just seems
because
wrong.
Because it seems like you agree with it sort of in premise, but you also seem to think that it's an overstep, and I think that's realistic. I think a lot of people could buy into this just because they like the idea of taxing the rich more. But again, if this is going to face a bunch of legal challenges, and then if it promotes people to maybe move out of state, so it's self-defeating in that way, I don't know. And again, like you're saying, if this isn't just a sort of states' rights issue, but potentially a competition between different states having to deal with legally how they're going to process this stuff and how that's going to affect their tax revenue, all these problems.
Do you remember
I don't know.
AOC? It is interesting, and so it's. I see what you mean when you say I think I'm being cautious on it. No, it has to be legal, right? I mean, it has to make sense. It was kind of like the reason I was against when Hillary Clinton was making that gun argument, where she was like, "We're going to pass a law that criminalizes gun shops if a product that they use kills somebody else." And I'm like, how do you do that? Like, either that, and it's like, that's such a squirrely, snakish way to do that. If you're going to do that, you need to pass a law saying you're not going to allow this particular gun or that gun. But trying to criminalize gun owners, that you basically tacitly give them approval because you said the Second Amendment exists, but then you're going to try to go after them after they sell a product that kills somebody else. No, I'm not a big fan of guns. And yes, I do see a problem with her being squirrely in that way of trying to get something like that through the back door. No, I want this stuff to be legal. It doesn't make sense, but she'd argue that. And if you remember, her pitch was basically, this is the way we should go to deal with gun violence. And it's like, no, if you're going to do it, do it. And don't do this backhanded way. Get the law passed. Like, the law is the thing that you need to get.
Actually do it. Yeah, be realistic.
Be honest.
Be kind of pragmatic.
Right.
Yeah. You got to
be
go
honest
into
about it.
We'll be back in a minute. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is our number. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Tune in Tuesdays to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for Women in Society with Professor Hannah Dickinson, where we talk about the major issues, challenges, and struggles facing women in all aspects of society. Hannah Dickinson, professor and organizer with the Geneva Women's Assembly, joins the show this Tuesday and every Tuesday on Loud and Clear.
Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Again, we're taking calls this segment. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. 202-521-1320. We are on the radio right now. That may be exactly how you're listening to us, but if it's not, I'll tell you how you can. We're on in DC, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM there, and 1140 AM. Also play online all over the place. We're on Spreaker, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Apple Music. We're on Spotify. Those are our audio-centric options. For video, you can check us out on YouTube, youtube.com. Just go to there, do a search for Fault Lines Radio and or Jamarl Thomas. Either one of those search strings, queries, will lead you to our channels every morning, every workday, every morning we're live. We have 7 to 10 a.m. Live video broadcast there. Jamarl's channel has actual video of him for now. We're trying to figure out dual video at some point. And then over on Twitter, just go to twitter.com/faultlinesradio. You will find the Periscope feed up top. That is also live video, although it's largely just audio. But hey, you can have that. Again, I like this on my phone because I can have it up on Periscope in the app, and then I can lock my phone and the audio will still play, unlike YouTube. Anyway, that's why I'm recommending that one. But just, go ahead and follow us on Twitter do that whole stuff. And with that out of the way, we are taking calls 202-521-1320. We have Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. Don't worry, I have a alarm clock coming to the house on its way. A super loud one. Look, I want to clarify something from last week. I am pro-vaccine safety. I take a vaccine. I barely do take them, but if it's safe, okay, I just have to clarify that from last week, but it got to be safe. Abdul Baraka tweeted out something yesterday saying that the Democratic Party is trying to keep the Green Party off the ballots in certain states. So I put that link to y'all link for today for the shows today. Melanie Weaver interviewed two whistleblowers, Tory Sayers and Patrick Burge. And I saw the film. It was kicked out of YouTube, but it's on banned video with Alex Jones' site. It's pretty interesting. I think those two the Senate should ask them some questions to find out what's going on. I think it's conjecture. The other thing is might have some facts to it, so it needs to be looked at. And also, my case, whistleblower, I'm a whistleblower myself, and the closer we get to these elections, I'm experiencing a lot of weirdness happening around me. So I got to throw this out there to y'all to, hopefully one day y'all can interview me. I have to bring this up again so I get my case out. It only 7 minutes will be good. I'm going to try to do it succinctly whenever y'all ready for me to do. And right now, that's about it. That's all I want to say.
Cool. Thank you for the call, Tarif. Yeah, we should have you on soon. That'd be good. We've talked about it for a while. Yeah, we are taking calls, by the way. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. 202-521-1320 is the number to call. We're talking about, in our back chat for a second, we haven't really talked about this today, Trump talking about a pardon, and he hasn't said exactly whom. He was briefly talking about Snowden, but apparently the one that he's pondering today doesn't have anything to do with Snowden. What's your take on this, Jamarl? Any idea, any opinion who this might be?
I don't know. I mean, I'm sitting here trying to get my head around this. This is Reuters. President Donald Trump said on Monday he would pardon a very, very important person on Tuesday, but added it would not be leaker Edward Snowden, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Doing a pardon tomorrow on someone who is very, very important, Trump told Reuters on Air Force One. He declined to offer further details except to say it was not Flynn or Snowden, a former U.S. National Security Agency contractor now living in, basically, Russia. Let's see. And earlier on, when Trump was asked about this, he said he was considering a pardon on Snowden, but at this point, I guess that's off the table. I have no idea who this could be. I thought it could be Assange, but I don't think that's going to be the case. So I don't know who else it might be. We have another caller, though. Let's go to Ben in Ohio. What's going on, Ben?
Hey, Jamal, how are you? How you guys doing?
Good. How's it going, Ben?
So, yeah. So I was, my statement is mainly about the convention. So, or at least just like the overall state of the race. Like my personal theory is that because the DNC can so reliably, they can win knowing that, okay, well, progressives and whatnot will vote for them anyway, that they're really only focusing on like moderate Republicans and stuff like that and older folks. And that's why all their messaging and whatnot is, I don't want to say Trumpian, but like traditional, like establishment Republican. And I think that that's the direction that they want to go, regardless.
Ben, that's true.
It might be.
Yeah. That's perfectly true. I mean, look, if I'm in a political contest and I have 1,000 people clawing at me for things that they want, and typically 90% of the races are won by the side with the most cash. Typically, politicians spend 75% of their time begging for cash. And if that's your world, then you have to dole out and give out stuff in order for you to get in office. And in this case, this is material, and this is coming from people who are in a 1% distribution. If you know that groups are going to vote for you as is, as a given, then you give less attention to those groups because you know you already have their support. So blacks, Hispanics, and lefties will get told you have nowhere else to go. Or Joe Biden would just say succinctly, go vote for the other guy. Because in his head, you're stuck with him. So from the standpoint of policy, from the standpoint of what they want to do in that office, they move to the right. And they appropriate, they try to push policy and messaging with this notion of trying to bring in Republicans. But their assumption is that they already have basically the other groups that are stuck, the battered wives of the political spectrum, lefties, blacks, and Hispanics. They have nowhere else to go. Yes, you're absolutely right, Ben. Shane, you want to take a quick one before we go to Rod?
I think my only response there was just that they might be taking a sort of tiered marketing strategy or something like that. What you're seeing in the convention, they're probably figuring the younger folks aren't watching. So their messaging there is probably going to be aimed at older folks. On the other hand, their policies definitely aren't representative of what young people want, as far as I can tell. Young people are pretty left. Young people seem to have voted disproportionately for Bernie. So I think you're right in that sense. But just in terms of how they were talking, the language they were using, that kind of thing, what you were saying at the convention was probably aimed intentionally at older voters. That would be my guess.
We have a quick news report. I think this from anonymous person from some anonymous thing, that just before the convention, that the battered white lefties of the political spectrum were lined up all the way down the street. And Joe Biden, Kamala Harris ran down slapping each one in the face. All of the lefties said they would still vote for each one of those people. I don't remember who said that, but somebody said that in Twitter.
There you go. Trustworthy anonymous reports. All right, we've got Rod from Philly calling in. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. But Rod, you're on. What's going on?
Good morning, guys. I wanted to take a guess. I think I have a guess who Trump's going to pardon. I believe it's going to be Marcus Garvey. The only reason I believe that is because he's friends with Roger Stone, and he's been saying that for years, that he wanted Marcus Garvey pardoned. So I believe Donald Trump's going to make a somewhat of a political move, because if he does pardon Marcus Garvey, a lot of the population is going to say, well, who's Marcus Garvey? And then they're going to do a little dive and see who he is and what he's done and what he was about. And then that's going to kind of put them in a weird position as far as someone like Donald Trump, who's been for the last 4 years been compared to Hitler, pardoning someone like Marcus Garvey. So that's just my guess. I could be wrong, but let's see what happens.
Man, that is an out of left field guess, but I like it. Black Star Liner shall come. Interesting call on that one.
I'm sitting here looking up Trump's relationship, and apparently the family was trying to get Marcus Garvey a pardon in the waning days of Barack Obama's presidency. And apparently Obama wouldn't do it. Now, of course Obama wouldn't do it, because, this is like Nixon going to China. Republicans always attack Democrats as being weak. And so if Democrats do something that's weak, it fits within the context of their actions. You have to be strong enough to be able to fight that and still do X, Y, Z. But oftentimes Democrats just kind of fold into that stuff. And so you get Nixon who goes to China, but because Nixon is a strong guy, it's okay that he does it. Well, the same thing plays out in these kind of relations in the politics in this way. So Obama, who understood early on that he could be a president that just so happens to be black, as opposed to a black president. This was something that was being discussed. He could never do this. He wouldn't want to deal with the attacks on him, the pushback on him from Republicans that say, see, this black president is getting these black people. He would never touch that with 1,000.
Oh, wait, Jamarl.
Yeah, I don't think he would touch it.
Okay. I want to do a reality check here. I want to do a temperature check in the room or something like that. What do you think would be the impact if Trump did this? How would that affect how black voters in America see Trump? Because if that would be huge. That seems like that would be a huge symbolic move. What's your take on that?
It would be a symbolic move. But look, Trump could do it. It would have no negative impact on him to do this.
It could have. I think it's. I don't think, Rod. That may be. I think that's coming kind of out of nowhere. I'm not sure I don't think that's going to be the case. But again, that would be significant. You're taking a caller earlier who's talking about stopping being a Democrat, switching over to the Republican Party. It seems like there's something in the air that is pushing people in that direction. Because again, I don't know. Part of me, my heart yearns for this. It's interesting because again, I'm coming at this from the center. I've seen for so long the potential for the right to sort of pick up black voters by actually doing things for black Americans through, I've tied it into the America's industrial policy, but I just think there's room there, especially if you look at the great stains on America's moral history I would say internationally, you have our imperialism. That's a little bit more recent, but that's old too. And then you have obviously slavery, and then the genocide of Native Americans. So you have these three things, and I think that there's this potential for the right to try to sort of reconcile itself with America and save America by actually confronting those issues head on, and in the process being patriotic and sort of, I don't know, doing this higher level thing with American history. I see the potential for that. And if Trump does that, I don't know, it's just another step in that direction. That's what makes me a little bit optimistic about it, but shouldn't let my dreams steal my vision. I don't know. We've also got another caller. Maybe we should go.
Go to the caller.
Got Lamont calling in from New Jersey. Lamont, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. I hope you guys are doing well, man. Got a really, really solid show this morning, man. I've been enjoying every minute of it. I just want to say, I want to say this, but then I want to ask you guys a question to kind of follow up to that, what I'm about to ask. But what I want to say is that I've often said that, people, like especially the working class here in this country, need to be brought back into the spotlight. Now, what do I mean by that? I just mean that, I wondered to myself, what is it going to take, just kind of like how you guys were kind of pondering now on the show, what is it going to take, for disenfranchised people to get the representation that they need in this country? Now, is it something where we need to get the government, the state to kind of, enact these policies that would kind of like lift the American people a little more so, kind of just dissolve class structures and things like that exist in the country? Or is it a type of thing where the people themselves need to kind of collectivize and, amongst themselves, create kind of like what we're seeing now to some degree, just these mass movements to kind of get their voices heard? Because I think to myself too, like for instance, when Roosevelt was president, had it not been for the trade unionists and people collectivizing again, coming together, would he have passed all of the social policies that he did if it weren't for that kind of I guess I want to say mounted pressure on him from the people? Do we need to get back to that? Because it just doesn't seem that that the people are getting that kind of representation that they deserve. Because if we just look at the political landscape, this duopoly that is the Republican and Democratic establishments make it increasingly hard for any third-party voters or just any third party in general to come onto the scene. So, do we need them, or just do we need us?
Maybe they don't. Maybe we're entering this weird period where we don't need them and they don't need us. We're kind of operating on some sort of weird adjacent spheres of activity where what we need is to build up our own collective capacity, individually. And I'm starting to sound like a leftist, but I just genuinely mean, as a conservative, as somebody on the left, whatever you need to do, build up your own activism, build up your grassroots. You can do that without them. And frankly, if there's this disconnection where you're not able to really, they're not, you can't hold them to account, then just let them do their thing, build up your capacity. And then at a certain point, there's more to it. There's more to the story. But at a certain point, if you've done a good enough job building what you can do, then ideally you can take the reins over. That's what I would go for. But that's a big question. There's a lot of stuff we can talk about there. Thank you for the call, Lamont. Let's go into a break. We'll be back in a minute speaking with Michael Maloof. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Thanks so much for saying you enjoyed the show, by the way, Lamont. Really appreciate it. Be back in a minute. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined for this segment and the next by Michael Maloof. He's a former senior security policy analyst in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He's also an author and a regular contributing analyst on RT and on other media outlets. Altogether, he has nearly 30 years of federal service in the United States Department of Defense. Michael, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
Well, fine. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you again. Where the show is better for you sticking with us. A quick question. We're going to move right over to Belarus. We're talking about Venezuela, Iran, these tankers that were recently seized. But let's start with Belarus. What do you think of Lukashenko's prospects at this point? Do you think this represents a serious threat? Again, Lukashenko, longtime leader, decades in the leadership of that country, called the dictator by the West. What do you think this actually forebodes for his leadership in the country, these protests?
Well, no dictatorships last forever, and I think what he senses as a result of these protests coming up is outside interference, increasingly outside interference, particularly from the United States at this point, and elements of Western Europe. I cannot help but recall these events leading up to the downfall in Ukraine a number of years ago. We're seeing the same pattern of behavior, Western pressures, and right along the Russian Federation. It's reminiscent of what we repeatedly see in terms of U.S. Efforts for regime change, even though from a policy perspective, that's no longer the case, but just the opposite is true. I think in terms of his longevity, I think if he tries to amend the Constitution as he says he does and reflects upon people's needs, there's a chance he could survive. But it really, I think just because people are tired of him does not mean that they should be kicking him out the way they did. After all, he was duly elected. Whether or not it was rigged, people say it is, but no evidence. There has been no evidence of that pointed to. And I just go ahead.
I was just going to say okay. If the election was rigged, at that point he's illegitimate just by definition. Because look, if you're having an election and the entire point of the election is for the public to say, yes, this is the individual who we want, meaning public is given its approval, and you find that to be fraudulent, then he's not duly elected under that situation. How do you know? And I'm not asking this in a hostile way. I'm just kind of asking. How do we know if... Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You just don't know because he was elected by something like 80%. People keep re-electing him, and yet I have not seen the hard evidence that it was rigged. I hear claims of that, just like we hear similar claims in the United States that things are rigged, but no one brings out the evidence.
No, that's fair. But how do we know that the U.S. is involved in trying to destabilize the country? Like, how do we know that the protests aren't just organic in and of themselves based on internal factors of the country? And just on a second piggyback to that, what were the factors that have led up to this much consternation in the country in and of itself where he's being threatened with being taken out of office?
Well, I think people are tired of an authoritarian approach. They see that he doesn't admit that he's perfect. I mean, he does have an authoritative bent about him, and he's very doctrinaire about it. Yet he gets reelected, but I have not seen the evidence come forward where it was rigged. And then when you have demonstrations, you're allowed to have peaceful demonstrations. He's been allowing peaceful demonstrations. It's only when we see people firing on the police that they're going to respond, and that's basically what happened in Belarus. Apparently, some kid was going to throw a hand grenade at the cops, and the thing blew up in his hand. Now they made the kid a martyr. and they're saying that this was done by the police. Well, apparently it was not. And I think that these are the kinds of things that need to be brought out. That and what's occurring is the West is trying to cast aspersions on this on him in order to just get him ousted because he happens to be close to Putin, and even though he has differences with Putin, and I just think that, and over the years now he has been giving hints of wanting to look more westward. I know for a fact when I was at the Defense Department, we had liaison with his customs service and with his enforcement people. There were through our other government agencies in the United States. So it's not he's trying, even though he looks toward Putin, he also looks westward, and I think he's been trying to get the benefits of both. We see that with Turkey. We see that with a lot of other countries that they walk that real thin line, and in this case, people just want him ousted, and we have neoconservatives in this country that want to push NATO right up to the Federation, and that is absolutely contrary to the understanding that went back to the days of Clinton, who promised not to do that, and basically the United States broke its promise to Putin. And from the Russian perspective, we see that they want to create a buffer. They're using Eastern Europe as a buffer. And now you have Poland that is a member of NATO. They want Belarus back. After all, it used to be part of Poland once upon a time. So we see these ancient histrionics coming out, and it's coming back into the present once again. Old animosities beginning to
Michael,
percolate here.
Those things always rear their heads, and that's a great point with Poland. Thank you for bringing that up. Another side of this that's just weird, though. If they're to be a buffer state, aren't they already? I mean, like you're saying, Belarus has been playing. You named Turkey. I think Ukraine also fits the bill, although obviously Ukraine was overthrown. Sure. Western-backed revolution. Yeah. I mean, it seems like the same tactic here. If they're to serve as a buffer state, shouldn't they be shouldn't that involve some at least nominal degree of independence from either Russia or the U.S.? Like, isn't that how that's supposed to work? To the contrary, it seems like we're doing this revolution. And I want to hand it back over to you. Last Friday, though, real quick, we had a guest. I want to follow up with the question. He was saying,
I think he's tried.
Yeah, no, go for it, real quick. Go for it, Michael.
I think he's tried, and but it all is because of outside pressures. It is a very strategic location from the perspective, geostrategic position from the standpoint of Russia as well as the West. And Belarus it just happens to be caught right in the middle, and they're going to get it. Just like Turkey. Turkey is a bridge between East and West. We see these. It's all location. It's like real estate. And
it's weird. It gives them a swivel position because on the one hand, they have these powers crunching them from either sides. But on the other hand, in some of these cases, they're put in the position of kingmaker, where they have, they have outsized power simply by their ability almost as a swing voter geopolitically in terms of what they can provide or what they can add or detract from either side.
Well, that's true, and we've seen this with Erdogan of Turkey. I mean, the man now has expansionist ambitions, and he's beginning to demonstrate that. And yet he plays off both sides, and both sides play him. So we see this continuously. I mean, this is the nature of power politics and the realpolitik that we see today in the world. And this is why you see right now we don't see any adult supervision. The UN is dead on arrival. There's no means of reconciliations of both sides. They've just got to duke it out and work it out among them, and it goes on a daily basis.
Mike, I always like to say that there's no such thing as international law. And honestly, if I am Russia and I am sitting in the position that I am in, and I've had my borders invaded, 20, 30 million people in one war, 20 million in another, 10 million in another, I would be very...
Wait, guys, I'm sorry, real quick. There's a breaking news update. We were talking about who Trump would be pardoning. News is in. It's Susan B. Anthony. So he has pardoned the famed suffragette, social reformer, Susan B. Anthony, born in 1820, died in 1906. Sorry for the interruption, Jamarl, but that is the breaking news. That's who he pardoned. That's interesting. Take it away, Yeah, no, Jamarl, I didn't mean to cut you off. Anyway,
no, you're fine. You're fine. I'm just saying my only point that I was trying to make was that if it's me, and I am looking at the way the world works, where it seemed like this is zero-sum power politic game, meaning might is right, even if it's wrong, and you use politics, you use economics, you use your media space, all of those things to accomplish your objectives. If I'm Russia, under no circumstances could I allow Belarus to fall into the hands of the West. This is the same argument I would use for the Ukraine. Under no circumstances can you allow that country to fall into the hands of the West. Because if NATO, an organization that lurched along as a zombie without any real function because, the Soviet Union no longer existed, gets right up to its borders, the United States and what NATO powers have been trying to do is very clear, and that is to undermine either Russia and China militarily and to some degree starve them off for the rest of the world in order to try to undermine those particular countries with the greatest prize of all, destabilizing China or Russia. So Belarus becomes a fault line in regards to that particular argument and that particular fight that's going forward. That's my perspective of it, but how does Russia look at something like that? I would imagine they're looking at Belarus in similar terms as they were looking at the Ukraine.
Well, if you're asking me, I would say that you're absolutely right on. It is a question of spheres of influence, and we have NATO and the West pushing right up to the Russian Federation, and and we also see initiatives by the United States particularly. It's already declared Russia and China, as you point out, to be adversaries, and we're emerging into Cold War II when it comes to China, but it's all a containment issue, and we see efforts by the United States right now to reorient itself in the Balkan countries in order to stop the growth of Russian influence into that area, as well as Chinese influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's an ongoing thing that's happening while the world remains focused on coronavirus and everything else. But there's all this other activity going on under the blanket, if you will, which will emerge one day, and everyone's going to be shocked and amazed as to how did we get here? And we're seeing this now, and with Turkey, for example, acting up, it's ironic, Biden in the spheres of influence.
Let's go into a break. That's a good outro. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back continuing the conversation in a minute with Michael Maloof, talking about geopolitics, moving on from Belarus, talking about more stuff in the next segment. We'll be back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you again in 1 minute.